The police officer arrested an elderly black man on an empty street without even bothering to ask his name. To him, it was just another suspect, to be humiliated and forgotten, as happened daily. But this old man turned out to be someone entirely different than he was perceived to be. He was the governor of the state. What happened after the arrest would shock even the most seasoned observers. But let's start from the beginning. Henry James, an elderly African American, was walking through the streets of a small town unfamiliar to him. He had deliberately chosen this quiet area to spend the morning without drawing attention. At first glance, he seemed like an ordinary person, just wanting to get some fresh air. No one would have guessed that this old man was the governor of the state, traveling incognito to get a closer look at the lives of ordinary citizens. At that moment, a police car was driving by, with Officer Thomas Randall inside. Young and ambitious, Thomas was known for his tough measures and prejudiced attitudes toward black people. Seeing Henry, who didn't fit the area, Thomas immediately grew suspicious. "What is this old man doing here?" flashed through the officer's mind. Without thinking twice, he decided to stop Henry. Thomas swerved to the curb and, turning on the lights, jumped out of the car. Henry stopped, surprised by such unexpected attention from the police. "Show me your ID," demanded the officer sternly as he approached. Staying calm, Henry tried to explain. "I'm just taking a walk, officer. May I know what this is about?" But Thomas was full of suspicion. He was used to assuming that any black man in this area could be dangerous. Without listening to Henry's explanations, Thomas grabbed his arm and, ignoring his protests, began to cuff him. "What are you doing?" Henry asked, trying to remain calm despite the humiliation. "You're under arrest on suspicion of criminal activity," Thomas said briefly, without bothering to clarify further. Passers-by began to stop, pulling out their phones and recording the scene. Henry didn't resist, but the deep sense of injustice was evident in his eyes. He understood that this wasn't just a misunderstanding, but a reflection of the bias he and others like him faced daily. Thomas, noticing the growing crowd, acted with even more confidence. But when Henry turned to him and quietly said, "You have no idea who you just arrested," a vague sense of dread momentarily washed over the officer. However, he quickly dismissed it, believing everything was under control. After Henry was pushed into the police car, Officer Randall, feeling his actions upheld authority, didn't even think to check the identity of the detained man. He was certain that he had arrested another, suspicious, black man who was probably involved in something illegal. Thomas couldn't have imagined that he had made a grave mistake. On the way to the station, Henry remained silent, only occasionally glancing calmly, yet meaningfully, at the officer. Randall, unnerved by the silence, began to feel uncomfortable. Still, like many in such situations, his pride prevented him from considering he might have made a mistake. At the station, his colleagues didn't bother to check the detainee's information, as the arrest of a black man in that area was nothing out of the ordinary. Henry was searched with indifference and rudeness, adding to the humiliation of the situation. The officers acted as if they were dealing with a criminal, despite having no information about his identity. Henry endured it all silently, remaining calm, although inside he was gnawed by the bitterness of injustice. He knew his position would change, but the question was when and how. Meanwhile, the video of the arrest, recorded by onlookers, quickly spread on social media. Residents of the area were used to such incidents, but the sight of an elderly man being humiliated by an officer in front of dozens of witnesses sparked a particular outrage. Comments under the video quickly fueled a wave of anger. Social media users began sharing the clip widely, demanding explanations from the police and justice for the victim. Local news channels soon picked up the story, drawing even more attention. People demanded answers. Why was this old man arrested? Why was he treated so harshly? Where were his rights? Public outrage began to grow, and more people started protesting outside the police station, demanding Henry's release. They held signs, shouted slogans, and called for justice. Many didn't even know who the man truly was, but his age and race made him a symbol of the long-standing fight against police brutality. This wasn't just an isolated incident. It reflected a systemic problem known to many in this city and far beyond. It soon became clear that Henry's arrest wasn't just a mistake, but could become a flashpoint for a society already brimming with grievances about police behavior. The crowd outside the police station continued to swell. People chanted slogans, demanding explanations and justice. Inside the station, Officer Thomas Randall, observing the situation, began to feel growing unease. At first he tried to ignore it, assuming that once everything settled down, public interest in the incident would fade. But events were moving too quickly, and his anxiety only grew. While his colleagues were trying to figure out how to manage the rising protest, Randall, sitting at his desk, tried to convince himself that he had done the right thing. His mind was still dominated by the biased thoughts deeply ingrained in him over years of service. He believed that if someone looked suspicious and didn't act as expected, it was grounds for arrest. But something about this particular arrest bothered him. Thomas recalled how Henry remained calm throughout the entire process, as if he knew something the officer didn't. Those words the old man had said, looking him straight in the eye. "You have no idea who you just arrested," now haunted Randall. There had been something unsettling in Henry's tone, as if he wasn't afraid and didn't feel helpless. This sense of superiority from the elderly man unsettled Thomas. What kind of person, being unjustly arrested, could react so calmly and confidently? These thoughts began to chip away at Thomas's confidence in his actions. The internal conflict he had long suppressed started to grow. He had always taken pride in being a law enforcer, but for the first time, he began to realize that not every arrest was just. Doubt gnawed at him. Perhaps this time, he really had made a mistake. Thomas knew that if this arrest turned out to be a mistake, the consequences would be severe. Public outrage was already building, and he couldn't imagine how the situation would end. He felt that no matter how much he tried to maintain the illusion of righteousness, it was about to crumble. Despite his doubts, Randall couldn't bring himself to check Henry's identity. Pride and fear of public humiliation stopped him. He didn't want to appear weak in front of his colleagues, who were used to seeing him as confident and uncompromising. Moreover, admitting his mistake would mean acknowledging that his biased views had led him down the wrong path his whole life. But the silence in the station was broken. One of the officers approached Randall with important information. "Thomas, I just checked the databases. It looks like we have more than just some old man here." His voice was tense. "This man might not be who we thought." Randall felt his heart sink. It seemed he was on the verge of something both significant and terrifying at the same time. When the information about the detainee's identity reached Randall, his world turned upside down. His colleague whispered to him that the detainee was none other than Henry James, the sitting governor of the state. Thomas couldn't believe his ears. How could this be possible? The thought that he had arrested someone whose name was known throughout the state was unfathomable. Randall stood up abruptly, feeling his face flush. He suddenly realized that he was on the brink of disaster, not only for himself, but for the entire police department. Arresting the governor without cause, especially with all the public attention? This was the end. He hurried towards the cell where Henry was being held, desperately trying to figure out how to fix the situation. When Thomas entered the room where the governor was being held, their eyes met, and he saw a cold, calm gaze from the elderly man. Henry sat on a bench, his hands resting on his knees, looking completely unbothered by what was happening. A faint smile played on his lips, as if he had known all along that things would unfold this way. "Well, officer," Henry said quietly as Randall entered, "I believe it's time for an explanation, isn't it?" These words pierced through Thomas like a knife. He felt utterly helpless. All the confidence he had carefully built over his years of service crumbled in just a few minutes. Randall tried to gather the last remnants of composure, and without meeting Henry's gaze, mumbled, You're the governor?" "Yes," Henry replied calmly, not averting his eyes. "And you arrested me without any reason." For a moment, there was silence. Thomas tried to collect his thoughts, but everything that came to mind seemed wrong. He didn't know what to say or how to justify himself. The only thing that could save him now was to somehow find a way to smooth things over. I didn't know who you were," he began to stammer, feeling the bitterness of his own disgrace rising in his throat. Henry, still outwardly calm, continued, "And that's the main question, officer. Why did you decide that arresting me was a good idea without checking who I was? This is what happens every day to thousands of people like me. You judge by skin color, by age, by neighborhood. But this time, unfortunately for you, you picked the wrong person." Thomas didn't know how to respond. It felt as though he had been cornered, and there was no escape. While Henry maintained his dignity, Randall realized that he was trapped by his own prejudice and injustice. Meanwhile, outside the police station, the protests grew louder. The crowd was demanding Henry's release and justice. Social media was ablaze with discussions, and news outlets were already giving the event significant coverage. Soon, high-ranking officials began arriving at the station, and the situation became catastrophic for Randall. When Thomas left the cell, he realized there was no point in hiding his mistake any longer. Henry was right, and this incident was bound to gain widespread attention. All that was left for Randall was to wait for the consequences, both for his career and his personal life. As Randall exited the cell, he was met with tense whispers and anxious glances from his colleagues. High-ranking officials and representatives of the city administration had already begun gathering in the hallway, quickly learning about the governor's detention. Authorities demanded Henry's immediate release and an explanation for the incident. At that moment, Randall realized his career might be over in a matter of hours. The officer was summoned to the chief, who was livid. In the office, there was a heated discussion between high-ranking officials and police representatives. Randall stood off to the side, his hands shaking, but he tried to maintain his composure. Every glance cast in his direction felt accusatory. "How could you arrest the governor without any reason?" one of the officials shouted, pointing at Randall. "Did you even check his ID?" Thomas remained silent. He understood perfectly well that any excuse would be useless now. Panic gripped him. This wasn't just a random arrest. It was a reflection of the systemic bias he had followed throughout his career without thinking about the consequences. But now, the consequences were clear. "Do you realize the whole country knows about this incident already?" another official chimed in. "The media is blowing this case up by the minute. This isn't just a mistake. It's a disaster." Randall tried to say something, but his voice failed him. He knew it was all over. Society had already passed judgment. The video of the governor's arrest had spread across social media at an incredible speed. People were leaving thousands of comments under the footage, expressing their outrage and demanding justice. The police department was under public and media pressure, making its future more uncertain than ever. Guilt began to consume Randall. He had always believed he was acting within the bounds of the law, but now he realized that his notions of justice and legality had been distorted by bias and fear of those he didn't understand. This arrest became a symbol of how deeply ingrained prejudice had been in his consciousness. Despite his internal torment, the consequences for Randall became clear. He was suspended from duty that very day, and an internal investigation was launched. The police department, trying to salvage its reputation, had to take strict measures. The public demanded not only his dismissal, but also reforms in the police force to prevent such incidents in the future. Thomas found himself at the center of public outrage. He had nowhere to hide from the shame, and even his colleagues, with whom he had once had close relationships, began to avoid him. Every step felt heavy. He knew that his previous life, full of confidence in his righteousness, would never return. Henry's words still echoed in his mind. "You judge by skin color." That phrase seemed to resonate with every event that had occurred that day. Randall realized that years of police service and public opinion had shaped him into a person with false stereotypes. Now, confronted with the consequences of his actions, he had only one choice: to admit his mistake and attempt to change. But by the time society had already passed its verdict, Thomas Randall was prepared to face the harsh reality and the repercussions of his biased decisions. Henry James was released from the police station to the applause of the protesters gathered outside. The crowd, seeing the governor step outside, erupted in joy and relief. But for Henry, this wasn't just a personal victory. It was an opportunity to address an issue that had long been ignored. He understood that this incident could be the catalyst for society to begin changing its ways. The next day, Henry gave a public statement. Surrounded by cameras, journalists, and protesters, he stood on an improvised stage in front of the City Hall building. The crowd fell silent in anticipation, and his voice rang out confidently and powerfully. Yesterday's incident was not just an accident or a mistake by one officer. It's a reflection of how deeply prejudice is ingrained in our society and the system that is supposed to protect us, Henry began. I was arrested because I didn't look the way some people think I should. This is the reality that millions of people in our country face every day. The crowd cheered and applauded at every word he spoke. Henry continued, but I stand here not as a victim, but as a witness to the fact that we can and must change. This arrest isn't just my story, it's the story of every black person who has been unjustly detained, humiliated, or subjected to violence by those who are supposed to protect. We can't turn a blind eye to systemic problems. I urge all of you, those who hear my voice, not to stay silent. We must fight for justice. His speech became a moment of unity. People from all corners of the state, inspired by the governor's words, began demanding police reforms. On social media, the case continued to be discussed, and major news agencies picked up the story, making it one of the main headlines at the national level. A serious conversation about the need for systemic change began, not just punishing individual officers, but restructuring the entire justice system. Meanwhile, Thomas Randall was in solitude, reflecting on his actions. Realizing his guilt and his participation in a system steeped in prejudice finally broke down his internal defenses. He understood that his mistakes were not just the result of personal biases, but also the product of the culture in which he had been raised. Despite everything, Randall decided to make a public apology. His apology came a few days after Henry's speech. Thomas stepped in front of the press, barely containing his nerves. His face showed shame and remorse. I made a terrible mistake, and I am ready to take responsibility for it, Randall began. I allowed my biased beliefs to influence my actions. I arrested an innocent man, not because of anything he did, but because I judged him by the color of his skin. That is wrong. I apologize to Governor Henry and to everyone who has suffered from similar actions. I know my words won't change what happened, but I am willing to learn, change, and help fix this system. These words marked the first step toward his internal transformation. The public received Randall's apology with mixed reactions. Some saw it as sincere remorse, while others believed it was just an attempt to save his reputation. But for Thomas, it was a moment of personal realization and understanding that change was possible if there was a willingness to change. The story ended not only with Henry's moral victory, but also with the beginning of significant reforms in the state's police structures. Under public pressure, supported by Henry, changes were made to the arrest procedures and police training, especially regarding racial sensitivity. The case with the governor became an example of how one mistake can become a catalyst for serious reforms. This story of prejudice, injustice, and systemic discrimination became a symbol of the struggle for equality and justice. Henry James, despite the injustice he faced, was able to use the incident to push for change, and Thomas Randall, as a representative of the system, experienced an internal transformation that showed that acknowledging guilt can be the first step toward correction.